I've replayed that night in my mind more times than I care to admit. Not because it was the beginning of something beautiful. It wasn't, not then. But because it was the moment everything in my quiet, carefully controlled life cracked open and bled into something wild, something dark, something I could never have prepared myself for. It was the kind of evening that dripped with money, power, and the faintest scent of deception, where chandeliers glowed like captured stars, and everyone smiled too perfectly, laughed too loudly, and pretended not to notice the predators in $1,000 suits watching from the corners of the room. I was there for the language department's annual fundraiser, dressed in a black gown that hugged my curves a little more tightly than I intended, my hair pinned in a loose twist, and my resolve armed with a polite smile and a half-glass of champagne. I had no idea that the man who would turn my world inside out was standing just a few feet away, his name whispered between nervous glances and hushed tones, as though merely speaking it too loudly might summon something dangerous. His name was Lorenzo De Luca, and even before I saw his face, I felt his presence, an unsettling shift in the air, the way the laughter dulled slightly, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I didn't know him then, not really, but I knew of him, because everyone in New York who read the news or taught Italian literature at Columbia had heard the rumors. The heir to the De Luca family, the youngest to ever sit at that blood-stained table of power, the man who wore charm like a weapon and smiled like sin. And because fate has a sick sense of humor, that's exactly the man I spilled my wine on. It happened so fast, a flash of red against the pristine white of his shirt, a gasp that caught in my throat, and the mortifying clatter of my glass rolling across the marble floor. I remember bending down to apologize, words tumbling from my lips. But when I looked up, the apology died in my chest. He was beautiful. In that way men aren't supposed to be. Sharp and dangerous, like beauty was something that could cut you open if you weren't careful. His dark hair was slicked back with the kind of effortless precision that screamed old money. His jaw was set in a line of quiet authority. And his eyes, God, his eyes, were the color of storm clouds right before the lightning strikes, deep gray with a flicker of silver that promised ruin. He looked at me as though I were something that had offended him personally. Then, in a low voice dripping with disdain, he muttered something in Italian under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. Una piccola professoressa idiota. A little idiot professor. He said it like I was nothing, like the world beneath his expensive shoes was all that mattered, and for a moment I think he expected me to blush, to stammer, to shrink under the weight of his arrogance. And maybe that's what I would have done a few years ago. Maybe that's what I should have done, to stay small, invisible, safe. But I didn't. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice calm and steady, my Italian smooth as silk. Attento, signore, I said, smiling sweetly. Potrei essere un idiota, ma almeno so cosa dico. Careful, sir. I may be an idiot, but at least I know what I'm saying. The silence that followed was exquisite. His brows lifted just slightly, and his lips parted. Not in anger, not even in surprise, but in something far more dangerous. Intrigue. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a woman, and certainly not by one who spoke his mother tongue better than he did. For a long, unbearable moment we just stood there, the sound of the gala fading into a dull hum behind us. His gaze flicked from my lips to my eyes, slow and assessing, like he was trying to memorize the moment or decide whether to laugh or destroy me for it. Then finally he smiled, and I swear it was the most unsettling smile I'd ever seen. It wasn't warmth or amusement. It was a promise, a quiet vow that he'd remember this. He leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne, something dark and woodsy, with a hint of smoke and sin, and murmured, "Interesting." Then he turned and walked away, as if he hadn't just thrown my heart into chaos. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake him from my mind. Every time I tried to focus on the speeches, my eyes betrayed me, scanning the crowd until they found him again, laughing softly with men who looked like they could kill with a glance, whispering into the ear of some trembling politician, his fingers brushing the rim of his glass like he was thinking about more than just business. Every inch of him screamed control, power, and the kind of danger that didn't announce itself with guns but with glances. I should have left early. I should have gone home, taken off that cursed dress, poured myself a glass of wine and laughed about it in the privacy of my apartment. But I didn't. Something about him, his voice, the command in his presence, the way he said interesting like it was a threat, clung to me like smoke. When the gala finally ended and I stepped into the cool night air, I felt his gaze again, even though he was nowhere in sight. It was the strangest sensation, like the city itself had turned to watch me, like some invisible thread had been tied between us, thin but unbreakable. That night I told myself it was just curiosity, that I was intrigued because of the insult, because no man had ever dared to speak to me like that. But deep down, beneath the rational layers of self-preservation and logic, I knew it wasn't just curiosity. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Later, as I slipped off my heels and undid my hair, I thought about his eyes again, how they didn't soften when he smiled, how they promised nothing but trouble. And I told myself I'd never see him again. But fate doesn't care about logic or self-preservation. It laughs at the rules we make for our hearts. Because the very next morning, when I walked into my office at the university, there was a single white envelope on my desk, sealed with black wax, stamped with a crest I didn't recognize but would soon come to fear. And inside, written in elegant, slanted handwriting that looked as lethal as the man himself, were 6 words that made my pulse stop cold. For the woman who speaks like fire. The moment I saw the black wax seal, something in my chest went still. The kind of stillness that doesn't belong to calm, but to the seconds right before a storm, when the air itself seems to wait, holding its breath, trembling with anticipation for the inevitable break of thunder. I knew, instinctively, before I even touched the envelope, that it was from him. There was an aura to it, a quiet arrogance wrapped in refinement, as though even paper and ink bent to his will. The crest pressed into the wax was unlike anything I'd ever seen. 2 serpents twisted around a dagger, their bodies forming the shape of an infinity symbol. It looked ancient, almost mythic, and it sent a chill racing down my spine because it didn't belong in a world of professors and students and fluorescent hallways. It belonged in a world of whispers and warnings, in a history that was never written down, but carved into flesh and memory. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Not because I was afraid, though fear was there, lurking just under my curiosity, but because I could already feel the way he was pulling me toward him without ever having to touch me, the way a current draws everything in its path downstream. The letter was written on thick, cream-colored paper that smelled faintly of smoke and leather, and when I unfolded it, I saw that same slanted handwriting I had seen in my mind all night, elegant and deliberate, as if each letter had been crafted by someone who understood the power of restraint. To the woman who speaks like fire, some words deserve to be heard in person. Dinner. Tonight. 8 o'clock. The address is below. Don't be late. LD. No questions, no requests, no apologies, just a command disguised as an invitation. For a long time I sat at my desk staring at the letter, the hum of the university outside my door fading into nothing. Rationality whispered that it was madness to even consider going, that men like him didn't invite women to dinner. They summoned them, tested them, devoured them, and that stepping into his world, even for an evening, would be like walking willingly into the lion's den. But curiosity, no, obsession, was a far more persuasive voice, soft and seductive and impossible to ignore. By the time the sun had set and the city lights began to shimmer like gold dust over the skyline, I found myself standing outside the address he had given me. A discreet, unmarked building tucked between a boutique and a private bank, the kind of place that didn't need a name because the people who belonged there already knew it. 2 men in black suits stood by the door, their expressions blank, their eyes sharp. One of them looked me over slowly, his gaze pausing just long enough to make my skin prickle before he nodded and opened the door. Inside, the world shifted. The noise of the city disappeared, replaced by the low hum of jazz and the scent of aged wine and something darker. Gunpowder, maybe, or power disguised as cologne. The lighting was dim, intimate, and I realized with a jolt that there were no other guests. Every table was empty except for one, in the center of the room, where he sat waiting. Lorenzo De Luca. He was even more dangerous in stillness than he had been in motion. His suit was charcoal gray this time, his tie undone just enough to suggest ease but not carelessness, and when his eyes lifted to meet mine, I felt a slow, deliberate pull, like the gravity of something far larger than myself. He rose as I approached, his movements unhurried, his lips curving into that same smile from the gala, the one that promised both sin and consequence. "Isabella Moretti," he said, his voice smooth and low, carrying that faint rasp of an Italian accent that made every syllable feel like a caress wrapped around a blade. "You came." "I considered not coming," I replied, meeting his gaze even though it felt like staring into the sun. "But your letter was difficult to ignore." He chuckled, a soft sound that held no real humor. "I'm told I have that effect on people." "I'm not people." "Ah," he said, his smile deepening. That much I already knew. He gestured for me to sit, and I did. Though my heart was pounding so hard, it felt like the pulse of a warning. The table was set with silverware that gleamed in the candlelight, and between us sat a single glass of red wine, already poured, as though he knew I would accept it. I did, because some part of me wanted to see what would happen if I played along with his game. The conversation began with harmless small talk, literature, travel, the city. But beneath every word there was a current, a rhythm of challenge and invitation. When he spoke about Italy, it wasn't like anyone else. He talked about it as if it were a lover he'd both worshipped and betrayed. His tone filled with nostalgia and something darker, a kind of longing that wasn't just for place, but for power, for control, for something lost. And then, halfway through the meal, he looked at me with that same cool amusement from the night before and said softly, "You have no idea what kind of world you stepped into when you answered me in Italian, do you?" I felt the heat rise in my chest. "Maybe not," I said, "but I doubt it's a world I haven't read about." He leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Books can't teach you this world. They don't bleed, on the page." There was something terrifying in his honesty, something magnetic in the way he seemed to see through every defense I thought I had. He didn't talk like a man flirting. He talked like a man studying, dissecting, learning what made me tick. Every question was precise, every glance deliberate, and even when he smiled, I felt the weight of a predator measuring his prey. But I wasn't prey. Not yet. I asked him why he had sought me out. What possible reason a man like him could have to invite a linguistics professor to dinner? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured more wine, his eyes on the dark swirl in the glass, and said, "Because you did something no one has done in a long time, Isabella. You made me forget myself." He said it so quietly I almost missed it. But when his gaze lifted again, there was no mockery there, only truth. Dangerous, unguarded truth. And it scared me more than any threat could have. By the time dessert arrived, I realized I had stopped thinking about leaving. The conversation had wound itself into my skin like smoke, intoxicating and disorienting. And I knew I was already in too deep. When I finally stood to go, he reached across the table and took my hand. Not roughly, not possessively, but with the quiet certainty of someone who always gets what he wants. His thumb brushed my wrist, and I felt that electric current again, the one that whispered promises and warnings in the same breath. "Thank you for coming," he murmured. "But be careful, Isabella. Curiosity is a dangerous habit in my world." I smiled faintly, though my voice betrayed the tremor in my chest. "Good thing I've never been afraid of danger?" He laughed softly, the sound low and sinful, and released me. When I stepped outside, the city felt colder, emptier, as though some unseen door had closed behind me. My heels echoed against the pavement, the night air heavy with unspoken things, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just walked out of one life and into another. When I reached my apartment, there was another envelope waiting at my door. Black this time, the seal still warm, as if it had only just been placed there. Inside, written in the same sharp handwriting, were 3 words that made my pulse stutter in fear and fascination alike. "Now it's your turn." There is a particular kind of silence that comes after you realize you've crossed a line you can never uncross, a silence that hums beneath your skin like electricity, the soundless echo of something inevitable. And as I stood in my apartment staring at the black envelope, those 3 words, "Now it's your turn," seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, as though the ink itself was alive, waiting, daring me to make the next move. I should have ignored it, torn it up, thrown it into the fireplace and watched the flames consume the evidence of whatever twisted game Lorenzo De Luca was playing. But there was a pull I couldn't resist, something raw and magnetic that made every rational thought dissolve like sugar in wine. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was compulsion, the undeniable gravity of something larger than desire, something that felt like fate wearing a devil's grin. I spent the next day pretending to work, answering emails, grading essays, forcing myself into the mundane rhythm of academia. But my mind refused to cooperate. Every word I read blurred into his voice, that low, measured tone that could slice through the noise of the world and leave nothing but stillness behind. I could still feel the ghost of his thumb on my wrist, the way he'd looked at me as though I were both a question and the answer. And I hated that my body remembered it more vividly than my mind wanted to. By late afternoon, I found myself standing in front of my closet, fingers skimming over fabric, debating whether to surrender to the inevitability of what was coming. The truth was, I had already decided. I just needed to make it look like I hadn't. I chose a dress the color of midnight, simple but devastating in its subtlety, the kind that whispered rather than shouted, that clung in all the right places without ever begging for attention. I left my hair down this time, waves tumbling over my shoulders, softening the sharpness I knew he'd look for in me. His world was built on power, and I wanted to meet him there. Not as prey, but as something that could make him hesitate. The address on the second note led me to a mansion perched high above the Hudson, its windows glowing like amber against the darkening sky, the kind of place that whispered of old money and older secrets. The gates opened without a sound as I approached, and the driver who'd appeared at my door an hour earlier, a man with a face like stone and eyes that had seen too much, escorted me up the winding drive without a word. When I stepped out, the air was thick with the scent of rain and cedar, the night heavy and expectant, as though even the weather had paused to watch what would happen next. The door opened before I could knock, and there he was. Lorenzo, framed by the warm glow of the foyer, dressed in black, his tie loose, his collar undone just enough to reveal the hint of a scar along his throat, the kind of imperfection that made beauty unbearable. He smiled, slow and deliberate, and said, "You're punctual. I like that." "I wasn't aware this was a job interview," I replied, stepping past him, though every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that every step forward was another cut into the fragile skin of my sanity. "Everything's an interview," he said quietly. "Some of us are just better at asking questions." The house was silent except for the crackle of a fireplace somewhere down the hall and the faint murmur of distant music. Soft old jazz that reminded me of smoke curling through dim rooms. He led me to a dining room where a table was set for two, candles flickering, in tall silver holders, the light painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. There were no servers, no guards, no distractions, just him and me. The world distilled into this one room, this one dangerous exchange. We ate, though I barely tasted the food. Every word between us felt weighted, charged, as though the air itself might catch fire if we pushed too hard. He asked about my work, my family, my time in Italy. Questions that sounded casual but carried an edge, like he was searching for the soft spots beneath my composure. I answered carefully, aware of the game, aware that he wasn't just listening to my words, but to everything I didn't say. When I finally asked him what he wanted from me, he didn't answer right away. He took a sip of wine, eyes fixed on me, and said, "You fascinate me, Isabella. You shouldn't, but you do. You move through the world as if you don't belong to it, as if you're visiting from somewhere quieter, safer. And yet when I look at you, I see someone who understands darkness far better than she admits." There was no flattery in his tone, only truth, and it struck something deep inside me. Something I'd buried long ago, the part of me that recognized the allure of danger, the thrill of being seen too clearly. "You don't know me," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I know the look in your eyes. It's the same one I see in the mirror." The confession hung between us like smoke, impossible to ignore. I tried to change the subject, asked him about his so-called business, and he laughed, low, dark, the sound of someone amused by how naive I still was. "You don't want to know what I do," he said, and when I told him I'd already guessed, that no one whispered a man's name like his unless blood was attached to it, he leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting with something sharp and unholy. "And yet," he murmured, "you're still here." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was just curiosity, that I wasn't one of those women who lost themselves to the thrill of a dangerous man. But the lie caught in my throat. Because the truth was I was still there, and I wanted to be. As the night deepened, the tension between us became something tangible, something alive. His words grew softer, his gaze heavier, lingering too long on my lips, my throat, the line of my collarbone. Every time his fingers brushed the rim of his glass, I imagined them brushing my skin instead, and I hated how easily my body betrayed me, how much it wanted what my mind condemned. At one point, he switched back to Italian, his voice dropping low, the words sliding over me like silk and sin. "Sai cosa voglio, vero? You know what I want, don't you?" I met his gaze and answered in the same language, my tone calm, even as my pulse thundered. "Non sono un tuo gioco, Lorenzo." "I'm not your game, Lorenzo." He smiled, that maddening, dangerous smile, and leaned in, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "Then don't play. But if you stay at my table, you'll have to learn the rules." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. And God help me, I wanted to accept. When I finally stood to leave, the air between us crackled like a storm about to break. He walked me to the door, his hand brushing mine just briefly. An accidental touch that felt anything but accidental. And in that moment I knew, with terrifying certainty, that I was already caught. That whatever this was had already begun to unravel the careful life I had built. As the door closed behind me, I turned back once, just long enough to see him standing there in the golden light of the foyer, his expression unreadable, his eyes following me as though he could still taste the words I hadn't said. When I reached the car waiting at the gate, the driver handed me a small box, wrapped in black ribbon. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a single silver coin engraved with the same serpent crest from his letter, and beneath it, a note written in that same elegant hand. "Next time, don't wear armor. I prefer honesty." I sat there, the night pressing against the windows, my pulse unsteady, the weight of the coin cool in my palm, and I realized, with a shiver that felt far too much like anticipation, that I was no longer just fascinated. I was already in his world, and he knew it. There are moments in life that split time in half, before and after. And that night, the one that began with the taste of red wine on my lips and ended with the scent of gunpowder thick in the air, became the fault line upon which everything that followed would tremble, a memory that would play itself over and over in my mind like a song I couldn't stop listening to, even though every note bled. After our dinner at his mansion, I told myself I would stay away, that I would put distance between the curiosity that burned too brightly in me and the man who seemed to feed on it. But distance, I soon learned, was meaningless when it came to Lorenzo De Luca, because he existed like gravity. Inevitable, invisible, inescapable. His presence clung to me in ways I couldn't explain. I would catch myself turning at the sound of footsteps, expecting to find those gray eyes watching from the shadows, or I would wake from dreams where his voice was the only thing keeping me from falling. 3 days after that night, I received another message. No letter this time, no formal invitation, just a text from an untraceable number that read, "Meet me where the city forgets itself. 9 p.m., dress warm." I should have ignored it, blocked the number, gone to bed and woken up the next morning pretending I was still safe in the soft academic world I'd built for myself. But I didn't. Because some part of me, the part that still hummed from the memory of his voice saying my name like it was a secret, wanted to know what came next. The address led me to a place I'd never been before. A quiet waterfront on the outskirts of Brooklyn, where the lights of Manhattan glittered across the river like scattered stars, and the cold wind carried the scent of salt and rain. There was no restaurant this time. No candlelit table, just the faint rumble of waves against the dock and a single black car parked beneath a flickering streetlight. When I approached, the driver's door opened, and there he was, leaning casually against the car, hands in his pockets, coat unbuttoned, his expression somewhere between amusement and warning. "You came," he said. That familiar phrase, though this time there was something softer behind it, something almost relieved. "I'm beginning to think you enjoy testing my judgment," I said, pulling my coat tighter around me as the wind tugged at my hair. "Maybe I enjoy proving you wrong about it." He motioned for me to follow him, and I did, my heels clicking softly against the worn wooden planks as we walked toward the end of the pier. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy, expectant, as though words would only break something sacred. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and I found myself wondering if anyone else in the world had ever seen this man the way I saw him now. Not as a rumor, not as a name whispered in fear, but as flesh and bone, solitude and sin. When we reached the edge of the dock, he stopped and turned to me, his eyes catching the light of the river. "You remind me of Sicily," he said suddenly, and the words startled me more than any threat could have. "Sicily?" I asked, half laughing. "You mean the place or the tragedy?" His mouth curved into a faint smile. "Both." He leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the horizon, and for the first time I saw something break in him. Not visibly, but like the slow, silent collapse of something built too high. He spoke then, not to impress me, not to manipulate me, but because something inside him needed to. "My mother was Sicilian," he began quietly. "She used to tell me stories, old legends, curses, saints, and sinners that were the same person depending on who you asked. She said every man is born with two shadows, the one that follows him and the one that waits for him. I never understood what she meant until I realized I'd been chasing both my whole life. There was a weight to his words that pressed against my chest, the kind of honesty that felt like confession. I wanted to ask what had happened to her, but before I could, a sound broke through the quiet, a sharp crack, echoing off the water, followed by another, closer this time, unmistakable. Gunfire. Lorenzo moved before I even processed what was happening, his hand gripping my arm, pulling me down behind a stack of crates just as splinters exploded from the pier above us. My heart pounded so violently it felt like the world itself was shaking with it. "Stay down," he hissed, his body shielding mine, the scent of his cologne mixing with the acrid tang of gunpowder in the air. I wanted to scream, to ask what was happening, but instinct told me to stay silent. The air filled with the staccato rhythm of bullets, the sound both deafening and distant, like thunder rolling across the ocean. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a gun, moving with the precision of someone who had done this far too many times before. And I realized with horrifying clarity that this was his world. Not the man at dinner with perfect manners and a glass of red wine, but the man born in violence, molded by it, fluent in its language. He fired twice, and the night went still. The silence that followed was suffocating. My hands trembled against the rough wood of the dock, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. He turned to me, his face pale beneath the flickering light, and for a moment I thought I saw regret flicker across his expression, a flash of something raw before it vanished behind the mask again. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice steady, though his hands shook slightly as he brushed the dust from my coat. I don't think so," I managed to say, though my throat burned from the fear I refused to show. "Who were they?" He didn't answer. He looked out over the water instead, his jaw tightening. "They weren't supposed to find us here." The words chilled me more than the wind ever could. When he finally turned back to me, his eyes had hardened again. The softness of the man who spoke of Sicily gone, replaced by the calculating gaze of the one I'd glimpsed at the gala. The man who could destroy and protect with the same hand. "You can't go back home tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They'll know who you are now." "What do you mean, who I am?" I asked, anger cutting through the fear. "I have nothing to do with this." His gaze softened, but only slightly. "You do now." I wanted to fight him, to tell him he was wrong, that this wasn't my life, that I didn't belong in a story written in blood and loyalty, but when I met his eyes, I saw the truth there. He wasn't protecting me out of obligation. He was protecting me because somewhere between that insult at the gala and the gunfire on the dock, something had shifted in him. He took my hand then, not gently but not roughly either, his grip firm, grounding. "Come with me," he said. "I'll explain everything later. But right now, if you want to stay alive, you'll have to trust me." And I did. Not because I believed him, not because I understood him, but because at that moment, surrounded by the smell of salt and smoke, with the shadows of his world bleeding into mine, I realized that fear and fascination had become the same thing. As the car sped away from the pier, the city lights fading behind us, I looked at him in the dark, the faint glow of passing streetlights illuminating his profile, the tension in his jaw, the quiet storm in his eyes, and I thought of what he'd said about shadows. Maybe he was right. Maybe we all have too. And maybe mine had just found me. I don't remember when I fell asleep that night, only that I woke to the smell of leather and smoke and the faint, rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt, the kind of sound that feels almost hypnotic when you've been running from something you don't understand. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, only that the world beyond the car windows had turned to darkness, the city a distant glow behind us, and the man sitting beside me was watching the road with the unshakable calm of someone who had seen chaos enough times to no longer flinch from it. Lorenzo didn't look at me when he spoke. "You should get some rest," he said quietly, his voice rougher than usual, as though the night had scraped against his edges. "We have a long drive." "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my throat still raw from fear and disbelief, though part of me hated how steady I sounded, as if pretending I wasn't terrified might keep me in control of something that had already slipped far beyond my reach. "Somewhere safe," he said simply. And even though the word safe had no real meaning coming from a man whose very existence seemed to provoke danger, there was something in the way he said it, calm, certain, absolute, that made me want to believe him, if only for the fragile comfort it offered. I turned my head toward the window, watching the blur of trees and streetlights flicker past like ghosts, and for a long time neither of us spoke. Silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable but heavy, like the air before a confession. I could feel him thinking beside me, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the wheel with too much restraint, as though he were holding back more than just the car. Eventually, the city faded into open countryside, the skyline giving way to rolling hills and the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. We drove for what felt like hours, until finally, the car turned onto a narrow gravel road that wound through a dense forest. When we emerged on the other side, a sprawling villa appeared before us, its pale stone walls rising against the morning mist, like something pulled from another century. It was beautiful and lonely, the kind of place that kept its secrets buried in the roots of the earth. He parked at the base of a long staircase and got out first, walking around to open my door. I wanted to protest, to tell him I didn't need his help. But when I stepped out and felt the cold air sting my skin, I realized I was still shaking. He noticed too. Without a word, he took off his coat and draped it over my shoulders. It was warm, smelling faintly of cedar and smoke, and I hated how much comfort I found in it. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The marble floors echoed faintly under our steps, and the walls were lined with old paintings and shelves of books in languages I recognized but couldn't immediately translate, their spines worn from time and touch. Everything about the space spoke of wealth, but not the kind that shows itself off. This was old money, old blood, a legacy too deeply rooted to ever be scrubbed clean. He led me to a sitting room where a fire already burned in the hearth, and when I turned to ask how that was possible, I saw a woman standing in the doorway, tall, severe, dressed in black, her hair pulled tightly back from a face that bore no trace of softness. "Miss Moretti," she said, her accent faint but precise. "I am Signora Valenti. I look after the house. Mr. De Luca informed me you would be staying." "Staying?" I repeated, turning toward him. "For how long?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a decanter on the table, handed one to me, and said, "Until I know they've stopped looking for you?" I wanted to argue, to tell him I couldn't just disappear, that I had a life, a job, people who would notice if I vanished. But when I looked at him, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the faint tremor in his hand as he took a drink, and I realized this wasn't a request, it was a warning wrapped in protection. "Who were they?" I asked finally, my voice softer now. "The ones who came after us." He stared into the fire, his profile sharp against the flickering light. "People who think hurting me means victory," he said slowly. "People who would use you to make their point." I swallowed hard, the words settling like lead in my stomach. "And what point is that?" "That no one is untouchable," he said, turning to meet my gaze. And in that moment, I understood that beneath all his control and power, there was something fractured in him, something built on loss and violence and the constant awareness that everything he touched eventually broke. For the rest of the morning, I wandered through the villa while he made calls behind closed doors. Every room felt like a memory: polished wood, faint perfume, old photographs of faces that looked too much like his. When I found the study, the curtains half drawn and sunlight slanting across the floor, I paused at a framed photo on the desk. A young boy with dark eyes and a smile too pure to belong to the man I knew. He was standing beside a woman. Beautiful, proud, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. His mother, I guessed. The woman from Sicily. When I turned, he was standing in the doorway watching me. "You look like her," he said quietly, and the words startled me so much that I almost dropped the frame. I set it down carefully and met his gaze. "Is that supposed to be a compliment?" "It's not an insult," he replied with a ghost of a smile. But there was something in his eyes that made my heart ache. A kind of grief that had learned to disguise itself as charm. For the rest of the day, he kept his distance, always near but never too close, as if proximity itself were dangerous. I could feel the unspoken tension in every glance he gave me, the quiet awareness that something between us was beginning to shift into a place neither of us could control. That evening, when I stepped out onto the balcony overlooking the valley, I found him there again, leaning against the railing, cigarette between his fingers, the smoke curling around him like a secret. "You shouldn't smoke," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He gave a faint laugh. "You shouldn't be here." "Then why am I?" He turned to face me, his expression unreadable, the dying light painting his features in shades of gold and shadow. "Because if you weren't," he said softly, "I'd already be dead." I didn't understand what he meant, not then, but the truth in his tone was undeniable. We stood there for a long time, the silence between us heavy with everything neither of us dared to say. The wind brushed against my hair, and when it caught the edge of the coat he'd given me, he reached out instinctively, his hand catching the fabric just before it slipped from my shoulders. His fingers brushed my skin, and the contact was electric. Brief, restrained, devastating. He froze, his eyes on mine, the air between us thick with something that wasn't just attraction. It was recognition, the sense that we were both standing too close to a fire we couldn't afford to ignite. "I can't," he said finally, his voice rough, almost breaking. "You don't understand what it would mean." "Then explain it to me," I whispered, though my body already knew the answer, my heart already beating to the rhythm of his restraint. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, the frustration clear in every movement. "You don't belong in my world, Isabella. And if I touch you, really touch you, you never leave it again." His words hung in the air, heavy, final, but the look in his eyes betrayed him. Because beneath the warning there was something else. Longing, hunger, fear. And for the first time I realized the truth he would never admit. It wasn't that he couldn't touch me. It was that if he did, he wouldn't be able to stop. There are moments when silence becomes a language of its own, a living, breathing thing that fills the spaces between two people until it feels heavier than words. And in the days that followed, that was the language Lorenzo and I spoke best. We didn't need to say anything. The distance between us said enough. Every glance became a confession. Every breath a negotiation between restraint and surrender. And though I told myself I was still my own person, still capable of walking away, I knew deep down that I was already caught in something that had no escape route. The villa became both sanctuary and prison, a place where time seemed to stretch and bend around him, where days blurred into each other in a haze of soft morning light and quiet evenings that ended with wine by the fire and conversations that always lingered just a little too close to truth. I tried to keep busy, to anchor myself in something ordinary, reading, writing, pretending to prepare lectures I would likely never give. But everything I did felt artificial, because even when he wasn't there, his presence lingered in the walls, in the faint scent of his cologne, in the echo of his footsteps down the hall. He had promised I was safe, But safety in Lorenzo's world was an illusion made of glass. Clear enough to see through, fragile enough to shatter with one careless touch. On the fourth morning, I woke to the sound of voices downstairs, low and urgent, and though I couldn't make out the words, I recognized the tension that threaded through them. When I reached the landing, I saw Lorenzo in the foyer, his back to me, phone pressed to his ear, his tone sharp, commanding, every word carrying the weight of authority. I should have turned away, but curiosity was a sickness I'd stopped trying to cure. "No," he said, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "She stays. She's not to be touched." A pause, then softer, almost weary, because I said so. When he hung up and turned, he froze for a fraction of a second when he saw me standing there, barefoot, wrapped in a thin robe, my hair still messy from sleep. His expression softened instantly, the steel melting into something warmer, but not enough to hide the tension beneath. "Who was that?" I asked quietly, though part of me already knew. "Business," he said, too easily, too smoothly, and I realized with a sharp pang that he was lying. It wasn't the first lie he'd told me, but it was the first one that hurt. "Business that involves me?" I pressed, my pulse quickening. He sighed, stepping closer, his eyes searching mine as if trying to decide how much truth I could handle. "Business that I'm handling," he said finally. "You don't need to worry about it." But of course I did. The rest of the day passed like smoke, thin and heavy, impossible to hold on to, yet suffocating all the same. Lorenzo disappeared into his study, and I spent the afternoon pacing the halls, my mind caught in a loop of questions I couldn't ask, and answers I was terrified to find. When Signora Valenti brought me tea, she paused at the door, her gaze lingering on me with something like pity. "Be careful, Miss Moretti," she said softly, her accent curling around each word like a warning. "Men like him don't save women like you. They keep them." Her words sank into me like a slow poison. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in silver threads, and wondered how I had ended up here, trapped between the life I once had and the one that seemed to be forming around him like a shadow I couldn't escape. I told myself I would leave in the morning, that I'd find a way to disappear, to reclaim the version of myself that existed before his name became a heartbeat in my chest. But even as I thought it, I knew it was a lie. Because I didn't want to leave. I wanted to understand him. The next morning, I got my chance, though not in the way I expected. I was in the library when I heard footsteps behind me, light and uncertain. When I turned, I saw one of Lorenzo's men, a younger one, probably no older than 20, with dark hair and nervous eyes. He froze when he saw me, like a child caught doing something he shouldn't. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to startle you." "It's fine," I said slowly, studying him. "I didn't know anyone else was here." "I'm supposed to make sure you're comfortable," he said quickly, the words tumbling out too fast, rehearsed. "Mr. DeLuca wants you to have everything you need." There was something about the way he said it that made my stomach twist. His eyes darted toward the window, toward the garden below, as if afraid of being seen. And then, before I could ask, he added under his breath, "You shouldn't trust him." The words hit me like a slap. "What?" He shook his head, pale now, realizing he'd said too much. "Forget I said that." But I couldn't. He left before I could stop him, and though I waited for Lorenzo to return, he didn't. Not that day, not the next. Only his absence filled the villa, the kind of silence that grows heavier the longer it lasts. By the second night, I was pacing again, restless, half furious, and half terrified, when I noticed a thin crack of light spilling from beneath the door to his study. I hesitated for a long moment, then pushed it open. The room smelled of smoke and whiskey and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. Papers were strewn across the desk, maps, photographs, and my stomach dropped, files with my name on them. I froze. There were photos of me leaving campus, notes in Italian written in Lorenzo's hand, details about my family, my research, even the address of my apartment. Every word screamed one truth. I hadn't stumbled into his world by accident. He had been watching me long before that night at the gala. The realization hit like cold water, and the room spun. I heard footsteps behind me, the quiet creak of the door closing, and when I turned, he was there. His expression unreadable, eyes like steel and sorrow all at once. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said softly, though there was no apology in his tone, only inevitability. My voice trembled when I spoke. "How long?" "Long enough," he said after a pause. "Before the gala." "You planned it," I whispered, my chest tightening. "All of it. The meeting, the insult, the letters, everything." He took a step forward, his jaw tightening. "I didn't plan what came after." Anger surged through me, hot and sharp. "You used me." He shook his head, his voice low, desperate in a way I'd never heard before. "No, I protected you. You were already in danger, you just didn't know it. You still don't." "I don't believe you," I said, even though part of me wanted to. He moved closer, and I could feel the tension in him, the pull he was fighting. "You think this is a game, Isabella? You think I wanted this?" His voice broke on the last word. "I wanted to scare you away that night. I wanted you to walk away and never look back. But you didn't. You stood your ground and I—" He stopped, breath ragged. I couldn't stay away. For a long, terrible moment we just stood there, the air between us charged and trembling. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from my face, and I could see it. The war in his eyes, the part of him that wanted to tell me everything, and the part that knew the truth would ruin us both. When his fingers finally brushed my cheek, the touch was heartbreakingly gentle, a silent apology that words could never carry. But I pulled away, because now I understood. The language he spoke best wasn't Italian. It was lies. Beautiful, careful lies spoken with conviction so soft they almost sounded like love. And the worst part wasn't that I believed them. It was that I wanted to. The night after I found the files, I didn't sleep. Though I lay in bed with my eyes closed, my body still but my mind moving at 1,000 miles an hour, trapped between fury and confusion, and that unbearable ache that comes when you realize someone you wanted to trust has already broken something inside you. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your ribs until it feels like it might splinter them. And though I told myself I was just waiting for dawn, what I was really doing was listening for him. For his footsteps in the hall, for the faint sound of his voice in the dark, for proof that he was still there. But Lorenzo didn't come. When the first pale light of morning slipped through the curtains, I got up and went to the study, half expecting the door to be locked, half hoping it would be, but it wasn't. The room looked untouched, the papers gone, the desk cleared as though the evidence of his deception had never existed. Only a single glass sat on the edge of the table, still holding the last trace of whiskey at the bottom, as if he'd been there not long ago, thinking about what to do with me. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, to force it to give me answers, but anger felt pointless in that moment. A luxury I couldn't afford when the ground beneath me no longer felt solid. So I walked outside instead, barefoot, the cold stone biting into my skin, and let the sharp air sting me awake. The villa was surrounded by endless fields, the mist rising off them in delicate spirals, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe it wasn't too late, that maybe I could still find my way out of this, that if I just walked far enough I could disappear. But I didn't get the chance. I remember the sound first, the deep growl of engines coming up the hill, too many for it to be Lorenzo's men. Then the shouts, the slam of car doors, and the unmistakable click of weapons being readied. My heart lurched as panic clawed at my throat, and instinct took over before thought could. I turned and ran, sprinting across the gravel toward the back of the house, the cold air slicing into my lungs. "Isabella!" someone shouted behind me, but it wasn't his voice. The next few seconds blurred into chaos. A hand grabbing my arm, the smell of gasoline and leather, the sharp sting of fear when I tried to fight back. Someone's voice hissed in my ear in broken English. "Quiet, or we kill you." And the words froze the scream in my throat. A black hood was pulled over my head, rough fabric pressing against my face, and everything went dark. The world became motion. Rough hands, the slam of metal doors, the vibration of an engine beneath me. I don't know how long we drove. Time lost all meaning when you're counting breaths to remind yourself you're still alive. I could hear muffled voices, angry, impatient, speaking a language I barely understood but recognized as Italian, harsher, more guttural. The dialect from Naples, maybe. The realization hit me like a blow. These weren't Lorenzo's men, they were the other side. When the car finally stopped, someone dragged me out, my knees hitting the ground hard enough to bruise, and the hood was ripped off. The light was blinding at first. A dim warehouse, concrete walls stained with oil and rust, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of blood. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, their faces unfamiliar but their intent unmistakable. One of them crouched in front of me, smiling with the kind of malice that only comes from old hatred. "You're the professor, yes?" he said in heavily accented English, his grin widening when I didn't answer. "The one he hides in his golden cage." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "What do you want from me?" He laughed softly. "From you? Nothing." He leaned closer, the smell of tobacco and sweat making me nauseous. But from him? Everything. And then I understood. I wasn't a target. I was bait. They left me tied to a chair in the center of the room, my wrists burning from the rope, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear the rest of their conversation. I caught fragments of it, words like ransom, family, revenge. But what terrified me most wasn't the threat of what they'd do to me. It was the thought of what Lorenzo would do to them when he found out. Because he would. I didn't doubt that for a second. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. The air felt heavy, time stretching thin. One of the men paced near me, restless, tapping. The barrel of his gun against his palm, while another sat by the door, smoking and checking his phone. I tried to stay calm, to breathe, to think of anything other than the possibility of not surviving the night. But fear has a way of making the world small, just heartbeat, breath, and the slow ticking of death waiting in the corners. Then suddenly, everything changed. It began with the sound of tires screeching outside, then the crash of glass and the roar of gunfire so close it made the air itself vibrate. The men shouted, scrambling for their weapons. But they were too slow. The door exploded inward, and for a moment all I could see were flashes. The muzzle of a gun, the blur of movement, the sharp scent of gunpowder. And then, through the chaos, I saw him. Lorenzo. He moved like a shadow given form, all fury and precision, the kind of violence that came from control, not madness. His suit was stained with rain and blood, his face pale and unyielding. And when his eyes found me, everything in the room seemed to stop. The shouting, the gunfire, even the sound of my own breathing. He said nothing as he crossed the floor, his men taking down the last of the attackers with ruthless efficiency. One of the kidnappers tried to grab me as a shield, pressing a gun to my temple. But Lorenzo's voice cut through the noise. Low, calm, lethal. "Let her go," he said, and the room fell silent. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a single shot rang out, and the man's body crumpled beside me, blood blooming across the floor. Lorenzo lowered his gun slowly, his eyes still locked on mine. And in that moment, I understood the truth I had been trying to deny since the night I met him. He wasn't just dangerous. He was destruction wrapped in devotion. The kind of man who would burn the world if it meant keeping what was his. He cut the ropes from my wrists himself, his hands trembling slightly as they brushed against my skin. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something break in his expression. Fear, raw and unhidden. "You're safe," he whispered, though his voice was hoarse, unsteady, and I realized he wasn't saying it for me. He was saying it for himself. When he pulled me into his arms, I didn't resist. I know I should have. But the relief hit me so hard it was almost painful, and all I could do was hold on, my body shaking against his, my tears soaking into his blood-stained shirt. He murmured something in Italian against my hair, words I barely caught, soft and broken. "Ti avrei trovato anche all'inferno." I would have found you even in hell. And I believed him. Because whatever this was between us, love, obsession, fate, it was no longer something I could walk away from. As he led me out into the night, the warehouse burning behind us, his hand never leaving mine, I realized the truth I had been running from since the beginning. He wasn't my captor. He was my fate. The world, after violence, always feels wrong, as if the air itself has been bruised, as if sound and light and breath don't quite belong to you anymore. And when I opened my eyes the next morning, it took me a moment to understand where I was, because nothing felt real. Not the silk sheets beneath me, not the faint scent of smoke still clinging to my skin, not even the low hum of the storm outside that seemed to echo the rhythm of my pulse. It wasn't my room. The bed was too large, the walls too pale, the curtains too heavy. I blinked against the dim light filtering through them, my body aching, my throat dry, every muscle weighted with exhaustion. For a long moment I simply lay there, my mind caught in that fragile space between memory and dream, trying to make sense of what had happened. The warehouse, the gunfire, the flash of Lorenzo's eyes when he found me. He had saved me. That truth was undeniable. But the question that followed, why, lingered like smoke I couldn't breathe through. When I finally pushed myself upright, I saw him. He was sitting in the armchair by the window, his jacket discarded, his white shirt open at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hair was damp, his eyes shadowed, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, as if he'd been sitting there for hours, watching, waiting, guarding. For the first time since I met him, he didn't look like a man made of marble and control. He looked human, broken even, like someone who had been holding the world together by sheer force of will and was now too tired to keep pretending. When he realized I was awake, he rose slowly, the movement careful, almost hesitant. "You're safe," he said softly. The same words he had whispered in the burning dark, though this time they sounded more like a prayer than a reassurance. My voice came out weaker than I intended. "Where are we?" "One of my properties outside the city," he replied, his tone low, deliberate, like he was afraid to startle me. "No one knows about it. You can rest here. You're safe now." There it was again. Safe. That word had become meaningless between us, stretched thin from overuse, but still I let it hang there because I didn't have the strength to fight it. I nodded, trying to swallow past the lump in my throat. "I thought they were going to kill me," I said quietly, the words trembling as they left me, as if speaking them out loud might make the fear real again. His jaw tightened. "They would have," he said, his voice flat, almost empty. "If they'd known who you really were to me." I frowned, confusion cutting through the haze. "And who am I to you, Lorenzo?" He met my eyes then, and something in his expression shifted, the composure cracking just enough to let me see the truth beneath. "The mistake I can't stop making," he murmured. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us thickened, stretched taut by everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say without shattering whatever fragile balance we were clinging to. Finally, I forced myself to speak, though my voice shook. You lied to me? You watched me, followed me, used me to protect yourself? And now you want me to believe this means something? He took a slow breath, his hands curling into fists at his sides. It does mean something. You think I don't know I've ruined you? That I've ruined myself? He stepped closer, his voice rising, not in anger, but in pain. I didn't plan this, Isabella. I never wanted you involved. But once I heard you speak that night, once I saw the way you looked at me like I was just a man and not... He stopped, his throat tightening. Not what I am. I couldn't stay away. What are you, Lorenzo? I asked, the words trembling between defiance and desperation. He laughed softly, bitterly, the sound hollow. A man with too much blood on his hands and too little left in his heart. He turned away then, running a hand through his hair, his shoulders rigid beneath the dim light. I watched him in silence, the realization dawning on me that this was the first time he'd ever allowed himself to break in front of me. Not as a performance, not as a strategy, but as confession. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, rougher, as if each word cost him something. Do you know what it means to inherit sin, Isabella? To be born into it, to breathe it before you can speak? My family made sure I never had a choice. I was 10 the first time I saw a man die, 12 when I learned how to make it happen. Every day since then has been survival. Not power, not control, just survival. And then you appeared, and for a moment I thought maybe I could still be something else. Someone else. His confession hung in the air like a wound, bleeding truth and pain and something I couldn't name. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady but my heart moving toward him even before my body did. When I reached him, I hesitated, my hand hovering near his shoulder. You think saving me redeems you? I asked softly. He turned, his gaze sharp but fragile beneath the surface. No, he said, shaking his head. Nothing redeems me, but it makes me feel alive again, and I haven't felt that in years. There was no defense for what he'd done, no justification that could erase the lies or the danger or the lives tied to his name. And yet, standing there in that dim room with the rain tapping softly against the window, I felt the edges of my anger begin to blur. Because beneath the monster I could see the man, and that was far more dangerous than the gun in his hand or the empire at his feet. He reached for me then, not like a conqueror, but like someone drowning reaching for the surface, and though every rational part of me screamed to step back, I didn't. His fingers brushed my jaw, trembling slightly, as if he feared I might vanish. And when his forehead rested against mine, his breath came out uneven. I don't deserve you, he whispered, the words breaking apart in the space between us. But I can't let you go. My hands found his chest, my palms pressed against the warmth of his skin beneath his shirt, and I felt his heart hammering there, fierce, uneven, human. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me, but instead all I could do was whisper, "Then what happens now?" He didn't answer immediately. His thumb traced the corner of my mouth, his eyes dark and endless. "Now," he said finally, "we stop pretending this can end well." And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't careful, it was a collision, of anger, of need, of everything we had both been trying to suppress since the night we met. It was a confession, a promise, a curse. His hands tangled in my hair, mine clutching at his shirt. And for a moment, the world dissolved, leaving only the taste of him, the heat, the ache, the impossible relief of finally surrendering to something we could no longer deny. When he pulled away, his breathing ragged. His eyes burned with something raw. "They'll come again," he said quietly. "They always do. But this time, they won't find you. I swear it." And for reasons I couldn't explain, I believed him. Because as much as I hated what he was, I had begun to understand it. The darkness wasn't what had trapped me. It was what drew me to him. The recognition of something broken that mirrored my own hidden fractures. As the rain poured harder outside, thunder rumbling like an omen, I realized the truth I had tried so hard to avoid since the beginning. I wasn't his prisoner anymore. I was his accomplice. And that terrified me more than anything else ever could. There are moments when the world seems to hold its breath, when everything that once felt certain begins to unravel quietly, strand by strand, until you realize that the life you thought you were living is no longer your own, but something that has been rewritten in someone else's hand. And as the days passed in that hidden villa, I began to understand that whatever story I had been part of before Lorenzo De Luca no longer existed, because now I was in his story, and his stories never ended with peace. The morning after his confession, the house felt different, heavier somehow, like the walls themselves had heard too much. The silence that followed our kiss was not the quiet of calm, but of storm clouds gathering above something fragile. He avoided my eyes at breakfast, his movements too deliberate, his voice too careful, as if we had both stepped onto thin ice and were afraid that even the wrong word could make it crack. I wanted to speak, to demand what came next, but fear held me still. Not fear of him, not anymore, but fear of the truth that I already knew but didn't want to say aloud, that I was in love with him, and that this love was a wound that would never heal. Later that afternoon, I found him outside, by the fountain in the courtyard, his coat draped over one shoulder, his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking Italian, fast and sharp, his tone colder than I'd ever heard it. I stood in the doorway, half hidden by the light, listening to fragments I could barely piece together. Words like accordo, matrimonio, pace, agreement, marriage, peace. And then, like a blade slipping between ribs, I heard the name. Lucia Bianchi. I had read that name before, somewhere in one of those endless articles about the De Luca family and their rivals, a name tied to another dynasty, another empire built on blood and silence. When he hung up and turned toward me, I knew he could see the question in my eyes before I even spoke. "Who is Lucia Bianchi?" I asked, my voice low, trembling despite my effort to steady it. He froze, just for a second, and that tiny hesitation told me everything. "She's the daughter of a man who controls half of Naples," he said finally, his tone even, rehearsed, detached. "A man who has wanted war with my family for years. This marriage will stop that. Marriage." The word felt like poison in my mouth. He looked at me and I could see it. The quiet resignation in his eyes, the kind that comes when a man is already halfway to giving up something he doesn't want to lose. "It's not what you think," he said softly. "It's not about love. It's about survival." "Survival?" I laughed, the sound sharp, bitter, nothing like the woman I had been. "You talk about survival as if it justifies everything. As if every lie, every death, every choice you make in the dark somehow becomes noble because it keeps your world spinning." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand what happens if I say no. My family dies. You die." "I already died the day you made me part of this," I said, my chest tightening until it hurt to breathe. He flinched, not visibly, but I saw it. A flicker of pain across his face, there and gone in a heartbeat. "If I could give you a different life, I would," he said, his voice breaking around the words. "But the world doesn't bend for love, Isabella. Not ours." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was lying, that there had to be another way, that love wasn't supposed to feel like drowning. But before I could speak, the gate at the edge of the property opened, and one of his men appeared, breathless, his expression grim. "They're here," he said in Italian, his eyes flicking to me for only a second before returning to Lorenzo. "The Bianchis. They've come to confirm the agreement." The silence that followed was unbearable. Lorenzo didn't move for a long moment, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the pulse in his neck. Then finally he nodded. "Tell them I'll be down in a moment." The man hesitated. "They brought her." "Lucia." When the Ausahe guard left, Lorenzo turned to me. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw something like desperation in his eyes. Not the cold, calculated kind, but the human kind. The kind that comes when someone is forced to choose between duty and desire, and knows that either way, something precious will be destroyed. "Don't go downstairs," he said quietly. "Please, stay here." But of course I didn't listen. I followed him. The main hall was a cathedral of power. Tall windows spilling afternoon light across marble floors. Portraits of long-dead men watching from the walls. Lorenzo stood near the center, his back straight, his shoulders set, as the doors opened to reveal a group of people dressed in black and silver, their presence heavy with quiet menace. Lucia Bianchi stood at the front, tall, beautiful, composed, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek knot, her eyes cool and assessing. She looked at him not with love, but with calculation, as though she were examining a contract rather than a man. When she smiled, it didn't reach her eyes. "So this is the house I'll rule beside you," she said in Italian, her tone smooth as glass. Lorenzo's reply was polite, distant, stripped of the warmth I had once known in his voice. "You'll find it accommodating." I watched from the shadows, my heart hammering in my chest, every word between them feeling like a blade pressed against my throat. Lucia's gaze drifted then, just for a moment, and found me half hidden behind the column. Her smile widened, not kind, not curious, but knowing. "And who is she?" Lorenzo turned sharply, his expression unreadable. "No one. No one." The words landed like a blow. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I turned and walked away, every step echoing through the hall, like the breaking of something that had taken too long to build. My vision blurred, my throat burned, and I barely made it to the staircase before the tears came. Silent at first, then shaking, unstoppable. When I reached my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, gasping for air, my hands trembling. I wanted to hate him for it, for that word, for the way it had sliced through me cleanly, efficiently, leaving no room for argument. But beneath the anger, there was something worse. Understanding. Because I knew why he'd said it. He was protecting me again. Always protecting. Always destroying. As the sun sank beyond the hills, the villa grew quiet once more. I sat by the window, the shadows long and cold, watching the first stars appear through the veil of twilight. Somewhere downstairs I could hear muffled voices, the sound of glasses clinking, the low hum of an alliance being sealed, and then faintly the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, approaching my door. There was a knock. "Isabella," his voice came, quiet, weary, broken. "Open the door." I didn't move. "Please." Still I stayed silent, staring at the reflection of my own face in the glass. Pale, hollow-eyed, a ghost of the woman I had been. "I need you to understand," he said through the door, his voice shaking now. "If I could give them everything and still keep you, I would. But the only way you live, the only way this ends without blood is if they believe you mean nothing to me." A pause. And that's the hardest lie I've ever had to tell. The footsteps faded, leaving only silence. I turned back toward the window just as the first flash of lightning split the sky, white and violent, and in that brief, blinding light, I saw something glint in the distance. Headlights, moving fast up the road, too many, too deliberate. Not his men. Something inside me went cold. The storm was coming again. And this time, I knew it would take everything. There are moments in life when everything narrows to a single breath, a single heartbeat, a single decision that splits the world open and leaves you standing on one side of what you once were and staring into what you will never be again. And as I stood by the window that night, watching the headlights climb the winding road toward the villa, I knew that whatever waited on the other side of that door would not just change him, it would change me too. The storm had finally broken, rain slashing against the glass in relentless sheets, lightning illuminating the hills like flashes of memory, violent and unyielding. Somewhere below, I could hear the muffled sounds of Lorenzo's men scrambling into position, the crackle of radios, the sharp bark of orders. The Bianchis were not supposed to come until morning, and that meant this wasn't diplomacy. This was war. For a moment, fear held me frozen, the kind of paralyzing stillness that comes when you know there's no safe choice left, only consequences. But then something inside me shifted. Something that had been trembling on the edge of awakening since the night he insulted me in that glittering ballroom, and I realized that I was done being a pawn in someone else's game. I moved quickly, pulling open the wardrobe where Lorenzo had left one of his jackets, the dark wool heavy and warm. I slipped it on, its scent wrapping around me like smoke and memory. I didn't know what I intended to do. I only knew I couldn't stay in that room waiting for men with guns to decide my fate. When I stepped into the hall, the house felt alive, humming with tension. The air smelled of rain and danger. Downstairs, voices rose, sharp, hurried Italian overlapping with the crackle of thunder. And then, through the chaos, I heard his voice, low and commanding, cutting through the storm like a blade. "Get her out of here," he was saying. "Now." "No," I said, my voice steady as I descended the stairs. Every eye turned toward me, even his. For a moment, he looked almost startled, not by the fact that I had disobeyed him, but by the calm in my face, the resolve that hadn't been there before. "I'm not running," I said. He crossed the space between us in 2 strides, his hand gripping my arm, his voice fierce and low. "You don't understand. They won't care who you are. You'll die for my sins." I met his gaze, unflinching. "Then let them see me bleed." Something flickered in his expression. Pride, pain, maybe love. Though love in Lorenzo's world had always looked too much like tragedy to name it out loud. Before he could reply, the front doors burst open, the storm roaring in behind the men who filled the entrance like a tide of darkness. Lucia Bianchi was among them, her face pale, perfect, and cold, her hand resting on her father's arm. Behind her, soldiers moved like shadows, weapons drawn, eyes sharp. The air cracked with tension. "De Luca," her father said, his voice smooth and venomous. "We warned you what would happen if you broke the terms of the agreement." Lorenzo didn't flinch. "And yet here you are, breaking them first." Lucia's eyes slid toward me, and the faintest smile touched her lips. "So this is the professor?" she said in Italian, her tone dripping with disdain. "The woman who made you forget your blood." I felt every gaze turn toward me, sharp and assessing, as though I were the fracture line in a centuries-old empire, and perhaps I was. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I didn't look away. Her father laughed softly. "You've always had a weakness for beautiful things, Lorenzo. Tell me, does she understand the price she's made you pay?" And then he said it. The insult that would brand itself into memory, words laced with venom and condescension. Words meant to reduce me to nothing more than the echo of a mistake. "Una donna così non vale niente." A woman like that is worth nothing. The room went still. I felt Lorenzo tense beside me, his jaw tightening, his hand twitching toward his weapon. But before he could move, I stepped forward. "No," I said, my voice calm, the sound cutting through the storm, through the silence, through centuries of men like him speaking and expecting the world to bow. "You don't get to define what I'm worth." And then, switching to Italian, my Italian, not his, I let the words pour out, low and sharp and alive. "Lei parla di valore come se potesse comprarlo," I said, each syllable deliberate. "Ma l'onore non si eredita, si guadagna, e il suo sangue non le dà diritto a niente che non abbia già rubato." "You speak of worth as if it can be bought. But honor isn't inherited, it's earned. And your blood doesn't entitle you to anything you haven't already stolen." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Lightning flashed through the windows, catching the glint of steel and rain and fear in the eyes of every man in the room. Lucia's father's face darkened, his voice trembling with fury. "You should learn your place, ragazza." "I already know it," I replied. "It's standing beside him, not beneath you." The words struck harder than I expected, not because of their defiance, but because they were the truth, and saying them felt like stepping into the woman I had been meant to be all along. The tension shattered then. Shouting, movement, the sharp click of safety releases, everything blurred. I remember the flash of a gun, Lorenzo's shout, the explosion of sound that followed, the world fractured into motion and light and blood. When it was over, the room smelled of smoke and iron and rain. Lucia's father lay on the floor, his men disarmed, the storm still raging outside as if echoing the chaos within. I was shaking, my ears ringing, my pulse wild. Lorenzo was standing a few feet away, his gun still in his hand, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one moved. Then he dropped the weapon, the sound of it hitting the marble floor echoing like an ending. "It's over," he said quietly. But we both knew it wasn't. The Bianchis would come again. The De Lucas would retaliate. The cycle would continue because men like them didn't know how to live without war. But somewhere within that storm, something had changed. Not the world, maybe, but us. When he turned to me, his face was pale, rain dripping from his hair, blood smeared across his cheek. He looked at me like I was both salvation and sentence. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "Someone had to," I said. He reached out, his hand trembling as it brushed my face, and in that touch I felt the truth of what we had become. Not lovers, not enemies, but something in between, bound by the strange alchemy of pain and passion and destiny. "If I live," he said softly, "I'll never stop coming back to you." "And if you die?" He smiled faintly, that same devastating smile from the night we met. "Then I'll haunt every word you speak." When the police finally came, when the sirens broke through the storm, when his men led him away in handcuffs, his eyes never left mine. There was no promise, no plea, just a quiet understanding that what we had wasn't meant to survive the world we were born into, but it would live in language, in memory, in the fire that refused to go out. And as I stood in the ruins of that house, the rain washing the blood from the marble, I thought about all the words that had brought us here, the insults, the lies, the confessions, and realized that the most dangerous language isn't the one we speak to others. It's the one we whisper to ourselves when no one else is listening. He had once told me that I spoke like fire. He was wrong. Fire consumes, but I endured. And in the end, that was the truest reply of all.